This tutorial is going to review creating a texture map for the outlet on a wall. We'll be using Maya to create the geometry, and we'll be using Photoshop to create the UV texture map. I'm starting by selecting my geometry, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose down at the bottom of menu, Assign New Material. I'm going to click on the word Arnold, and I'm going to choose AI Standard Surface. The geometry will turn white. The texture node will show up on the right hand side in our attributes. If you don't see it initially, click on the little triangle at the far right at the top until you get to the very last choice. You'll see AI Standard Surface. I'm going to name it, and then I'm going to go down under the tab named Base. I'm going to follow the Color tab all the way to the right to where the little checkerboard resides. I'll click on the checkerboard. It's going to give me my Create Render Node menu. I'm going to click on the second choice down, which says Checkers. It's simply a reference map built into Maya, so that when I select my geometry now, and if I would hit 6 on the keyboard, it will show me that texture. Now remember, 4 is wireframe, 5 is just grayscale geometry, 6 will introduce any texture map we have in our model. With my geometry selected, I'm going to hit W on the keyboard to see where my vertices fall on the surface of this geometry. In this particular instance, the z-axis is perpendicular. The blue axis, the z, is perpendicular to the surface of my outlet. That's the axis on which I want to plot my planar mapping. Planar mapping is a term that will allow us to map textures on flat surfaces depending on the axes that we choose. In this case, it will be the z. I'm going to hold my space bar down to get my hotbox. I'm going to go to UVs. UVs is the fourth bar down from the top and the second term in from the left. UV. I'll click on it, and I'm going to go down to planar. I need to go to the attributes for planar, and like many of the other tools in Maya, the little white box at the far right of that menu will give us access to it. In here, I need to choose my z-axis. You can see the options are X, Y, and Z. I'll click on the z-axis radio button, and I'll hit apply. You'll immediately see a virtual tool floating in your viewport. We're going to make our checkerboard pattern precisely square again so that our UV map is proportional when we create in Photoshop. To do so, I'm going to go to the upper right hand corner of the interface, and below the little lock icon are 3 polygon white faces. I'm going to click on it. Now I'm back in my channels window. In my channels window, I see the option for projection, width, and height. I'm going to make them both the same number. I'm going to choose the number 1 and hit return, and then I'm going to save. Now I'm going to click off of my geometry, go back to my object mode, and select. So you should see your bounding box as green for your geometry. Now once again, if I were to hit 5, I can no longer see that texture map. If I hit 6, it reappears. Now we need to add a tool to our shelf in order to set up the UV map to be exported to Photoshop. I'm going to hold down my Command and Shift, and I'm going to go to UV at the top of the user interface. I'm going to choose the very first term, UV Editor. You'll see a little green box with the checkerboard pattern that looks exactly like the checkerboard pattern on our geometry. With my geometry selected, I'll click on the UV Texture Editor, the green box with the checkerboard pattern inside. If your geometry is selected, it will be reflected over the checkerboard pattern in your UV editor in the form of a line of some kind. In this case it's white. And now I need to scale that UV map down to fit inside that checkerboard pattern. Now I'm going to go to View and I'm going to choose Shaded. And it gives me a better representation of that UV map. Now if in the event you don't see the checkerboard pattern, very often Maya just turns this off by default, you can go up to Image and click on RGB, and that will preview your checkerboard pattern. And another way it might be turned off is that there is a button on your dock of the UV editor with a little checkerboard shape. You can turn it on and off there as well. Now I need to scale this UV map to fit inside that checker pattern. And this is now called a UV shell. I'm going to right click, and then around 10 o'clock you'll see the term UV shell. I'll select it, it'll turn green, and I'll hit R on my keyboard to get my standard scale tool, and I'll click on the middle box where the vertices radiate from, and I'll click and drag to the left as if I was scaling geometry in my viewport. I'm now going to go to my viewport. I'm going to right click and choose Object Mode and select the geometry once again. You have to return to the object mode of the geometry to go to the next step, which will be Image, UV Snapshot. In the UV Snapshot, we get the opportunity to browse and put it in our folder. I'm going to name it Outlet Skin. I'm going to save it. Now I'm going to make the settings for the size and for the format that I want. Now, the larger the element in the context of the model, a person perhaps, or a very large picture on a wall, that would dictate perhaps how big the file will be. The image format I'm using is PNG, which will give me alpha channel, which will give me the wireframe shape by itself in Photoshop as my reference. I'm going to drop the size down to 1024, and then because the lock aspect ratio is on, it will automatically change that second number of our height to the same proportion. Now that I have got my format and my size, I'm going to choose Apply, and I'm going to close that out. Now the second part of this tutorial will take place in Photoshop, so I'm going to open that PNG in Photoshop. I've opened up my .png in Photoshop, and now I'm going to develop the texture map. What I see when I first open this is the UV map that was generated in Maya in the form of a black line, and the checkerboard pattern around it, which is the alpha channel. And that means that every other layer I introduce underneath this, I'll be able to see because it will be translucent where the black line doesn't appear. So I'm going to start in my layer window, and I'm going to go down to the bottom of the layer window, and I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to give it a color that will represent my background. I'm going to choose a pale yellow with my swatch window. At this point it really is pretty subjective, the color you may want to use. And I'm going to fill that layer with that color I've chosen. I'm going to either use my paint bucket by hitting G on the keyboard and using my paint bucket, or hitting Option Delete. Now I have to change the order of my layers, so I'm going to drag the UV layer map up above the yellow layer. Any other element I introduce here will be below that. Now I'm going to start by creating the plug graphic. So I'm going to hit M on the keyboard to get my marquee, and I'm going to hold down the space bar, and I'm going to choose the ellipse tool. I'm going to add a new layer so that I don't paint directly on the yellow background. If it's something I don't want, I can edit it, I can move it, I can delete it, whatever else I need to do without hampering the yellow layer below. I'm going to hold down Option and Shift and drag to develop an elliptical or circular shape. I'm going to make that black. Once again, I'd use the bucket or Option Delete to fill it. I'm going to deselect, and now I'm going to save. Go to File, Save As, and I'm going to make sure it's set for Photoshop, and I'll save it into my source image folder. Now, I'm going to make this a little bit more realistic, so I'm going to get my marquee tool again, but I'm going to use the rectangle marquee. I'm going to make a selection because my intention is to cut off the top and the bottom to create the outlet plug. Once I've got the selection the way I want, I'm going to select the inverse. And if I were to hit delete, it now deletes the outside part of that selection. I'll deselect and I'll save. Now I'm going to put a little bit of a reference. Now the detail of a texture map really relies on whether this is a significant part of the model or not. If I was going to do a close-up of the plug and the wire, then I would probably add a greater detail level, but in this case I'm just going to add some reference where the plug would go in. So I'm going to use my marquee again, and I'm going to click and drag on my selection tool. I'm going to put the white on top. I'm going to hit B for brush. I've got a soft edge brush, and I'm going to scale it down quite a bit. Now I could scale it by right-clicking and choosing from the pop-up menu, or if I wanted to, I could use the open and close brackets to reduce or increase the size of my brush on screen. I'm going to drop the opacity down to about 50% on my brush, so I can kind of gradually build the line I want. And then I'll just go in, I'll put reference where light might reflect off this black surface. I'll put a little bit more white where there might be more light falling. Now I've got one exactly the way I want. I'm going to hit V on the keyboard. Once I've tapped V, I've gone to my Move tool. I can now Option, Shift, drag a duplicate to the other side. I'll hit Command D to deselect, Command S to save. Once again, depending on the need for the detail, I could go into my layer window and I could go to FX and I could choose Bevel and Emboss. And you can see you can quickly add a 3D effect without actually having to build the geometry. So I'm going to put on Bevel and Emboss. I'll leave the default setting and just bump up the light a little bit here so you can see now there's a reflection where the geometry is. Now if you needed to change the direction of the lighting where it says shading in the Bevel and Emboss layer style, you can move that about and you'll see the light falls differently. So if I wanted to, I could have it fall more on the top and the left. I'll leave it like that. I'll click OK. Now it's clear I need another one of these. The one that is going to be down here will probably be covered by our geometry plug, but it doesn't hurt to put that in just in case it peeks out a bit. I'll get my marquee. I'll make a very broad selection. Make sure I'm on my Move tool, and then I'll Option Shift a copy of that entire thing down into position, and I'll hit Command D to deselect, Command S to save. Now what I'm going to do is I want to put a screw in the middle of this, again depending on how close we need to get with our renders. I'm going to get my marquee tool once again. I'm going to choose the elliptical marquee, and I'm going to click and drag a little circle. I'm going to get the eyedropper tool, and I'm going to select the yellow from my background, and I'm going to fill it with that yellow. Option Delete or Paint Bucket. You can see now we've got something that will resemble a screw. Now that I'm back in I'm selecting my geometry, and I'm going to right click and choose Material Attributes, and over in my Channels box that texture node will appear. Now I'm going to go down under the tab named Base, and there is Color, and that little black box with the triangle it over here represents that checkerboard pattern we applied to Maya to get our reference and our UV map for Photoshop. I need to disconnect this checkerboard now to add my own texture. I'm going to right click on the word color and choose break connection, and my geometry turns gray again. With the geometry selected, I'm going to go back to the color node. I'll follow it out to that checkerboard pattern. Again, I'll click on it. And then in the Create Render node, I'm going to click on the fourth tab down, Name File. It's represented by a little turquoise box with two black mountain peaks and a silhouette of a sun. I will click on it. I will go to the image name, and there's a yellow folder at the end of the image name active text box. If I click on the yellow folder, I can now go out to my source images, select my texture from Photoshop that I made, and hit open. And there is my outlet. Now, if in the event I need to scale this proportionally or move it, I can select the geometry. I can now click on the UV texture editor, that green box with the checkerboard pattern. And in there now, I can right click over the UV shell, choose UV shell, and select it. And with my scale tool, I can change the proportions of it. If I need it larger, I can hit W on the keyboard to move it. I could hit E on the keyboard to rotate if that were necessary. I'm going to right click on my geometry, go back to object mode, select my geometry, and hit Command S to save. This concludes the tutorial for the outlet.